Hi, welcome back to the LGR series podcast. This is our inaugural podcast where we're going to start exploring what happens when the map of local government gets redrawn faster than we can keep up. So this week, we're joined by Oliver Deed from E.C.F, a stakeholder engagement company who specialise in planning. And we're going to talk about, well, what happens when elections don't happen. So the big news this week has been across England, a number of local elections have been postponed, 29 of them being postponed, meaning some councils are serving up to 6 years without facing the electorate. On top of that, we had the announcement that mayoral elections were delayed in areas going through devolution. So does this mean that these councils are democracy dodging, or is it a necessary part of reorganisation? Ollie, what do you think?
I would say it's a necessary part of reorganisation. And I think it was quite interesting yesterday that the Secretary of State and the team at MHCLG were ringing around newspaper publications to say these elections haven't been cancelled, they've been postponed. So my sense is that they probably bit off more than they could chew when they launched this local government reorganisation process, didn't realise how complex it was going to be, didn't realise they were going to have to cancel elections or postpone, should I say, elections like these ones. And therefore, they've just, over the last couple of months, come to the conclusion that the best thing to do is give local authorities the opportunity to postpone. Although it does seem rather arbitrary the way that they've determined who's going ahead with elections and who isn't. But you might be able to shed a bit more light on that, Rowan, because you know more about this subject than I do.
But is it a necessary part of reorganisation? Democracy, at any price should be surely the answer. By dodging these elections, as it were, people aren't having their chance to speak, especially in what we know is a fractious political environment. And I think the courts seem to agree with me because they're allowing the challenge by reform to go ahead at the moment. Where does that put councils? If they win the challenge, that puts councils in quite a tricky position to suddenly have to try and reorganise or organise elections now.
Well, they're going to have to get themselves together quite quickly. It is right that it should be challenged in the courts. We have a process that you have to go through. And if the courts judge that this is the wrong thing to do, then so be it. I think everybody's just got to be a bit adult in this situation. It is a complex thing. Their local government is under-resourced at the moment, and they're having to deal with lots of different issues, including local government reorganisation, which is very, very sort of special circumstances compared to what normally goes on. So I tend to come down on the side that this is a necessary thing to do. I don't particularly like it. I'd rather elections go ahead. But ultimately, if in a year's time we're in a much better situation, then I personally see it as a good thing. So, and again, if you look at the complexion of the councils that have been postponed, it doesn't seem obvious to me that there's a political incentive for the government to actually postpone those elections. We're working in places like Harlow, which is a Conservative council. Who knows what might happen there? They could potentially lose that council in May. So there's no political incentive for the Labour government to be postponing that election.
It is the majority of councils that are up, have requested it, that are in fact Labour councils. Although I guess the counterpoint to that is it's a high water year for Labour anyway.
Yeah.
But is the Prime Minister, I tend to probably err on your side. I don't see what benefit the Prime Minister gets from delaying these elections to then just repeat a disaster in local elections next year. Surely you would rip the bandage off now.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like all the elections are going ahead in London. There's lots of local authorities in London that are Labour-led, and it's likely that Labour are going to lose lots of seats. So, as you say, they're going to have a bad day, I suspect, in May anyway. So why not just get it out of the way? There doesn't seem to me to be much political incentive to do what they're doing. So I don't buy it. I understand why people make the argument, particularly the opposition. I'm sure I'd be doing the same thing in their circumstances. But the reality is local government reorganisation is incredibly complex, and local authorities need to be given the space to actually come to terms with it and get to grips with it. And I see this as a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
But what about the mayoral elections? So the mayoral elections, for those that haven't been paying attention, part of the next stage of LGR, the devolution stage. LGR reorganises the councils and the infrastructure to make way for a mayoralty, and we've seen how that can be very successful in places like the west of England and Manchester in particular. And we'll come on to Andy Burnham shortly. With these elections being delayed, does it represent either the government wanting to slow down. Maybe they don't want to spend the political capital anymore on pushing devolution at this time. And B, is it not problematic because you need a mayor in right at the beginning to help form and structure those systems and set the standard and how it's going to work? We saw that with Ken, for example, in London and how he defined the role of the mayor of London. By delaying these elections for 2 years, essentially we're going to have an officer grey wash, are we not?
Interesting perspective. I agree that in an ideal world, you would have mayors in place quickly. You need that democratic legitimacy for these new organisations, and it would be better if the politicians and the officers were working together at the outset to actually put the structures in place. I agree that would be the optimal environment. But maybe I'm putting my too pro a government hat on this again. But I suspect that they've realised putting these authorities together is an incredibly complex task. Getting the personnel in place is incredibly complex, and therefore it's going to take more time than they'd initially anticipated. So again, I don't see any conspiracy in this, really. I don't see any issue. I just think it's a bureaucratic nightmare to have to do this, and it's probably better to give it a bit of space to breathe before you throw a load of politicians into the mix. But again, I appreciate you want that democratic legitimacy. I see a case for having mayoral elections as soon as possible as well, but I don't see
I think the mayoral
conspiracy
model
here.
is something that works quite well, and we don't want to see it really delayed because I think, you know, by delaying it and delaying the powers that come with it, I mean, the government will not hit its 1.5 million homes new target in these areas. If anything, you know, the stats show the planning slows down in the run up to and immediately after an LGR rollout. But it unlocks the economic benefits that go with this kind of transition. And I think that, you know, delaying it seems to me just to be a little bit more, I lean more on that side towards, yeah, Labour don't want a bad day because we know probably the likely outcome of a vote in Essex and that direction. These reorganisations are going to throw out some weird political results because they've not been tested before. And we've seen that, haven't we, before, where we have directly elected politicians like this, where you get strange results for mayoralties. I'm thinking of one, I can't remember, was it in the east of England, where they elected a complete random party. I mean, that leads us to the other issue about, you know, democratic mandate and output. These are massive changes, and this is devolution. So could it be argued that the government knows that voter turnout is going to be low, and is it right and proper to be devolving powers when maybe turnout is at maybe even as low as 20%, and of that, only half of people have voted for that particular candidate, meaning 10% maybe of an area have voted for the person that's going to have sweeping powers. What do you make of that?
Well, going back to your first point about mayors and the impact that they can have, I think if you look across the country where you've got really good mayors, dynamic, charismatic people, they can actually drive genuine change within communities. So London is a good example. We might disagree about which mayor might fit into that category and which mayor might not, but you look at Liverpool, you look at Greater Manchester, there's some really dynamic people that are driving change, and that's a good thing. In terms of your second point around are Labour cancelling this because they're slightly worried that they're going to end up with a load of reform mayors if they went this year or next year, I slightly buy that a bit more than I do around local councils, because having a whole series of reform mayors across the country would be a bit of a nightmare. Let's be honest, because being a mayor not only gives you a bit of a policy platform, but it also gives you quite a big media platform upon which to sort of project all of your narratives about how bad the government is. So they could probably do without that. In terms of democratic mandates and the level of turnout at elections, I mean, it's pretty shocking in this country, the turnout at local elections generally. I don't think that's a particularly strong case against having mayors or against doing devolution. Political parties have got a job to do to turn out the electorate and to really inspire people to come out to vote. And as you know, Rowan, I've just come back from Australia where you've got compulsory voting, and I'm actually a big fan of that. I think that should be introduced pretty quickly, but that's very unlikely. But as I said, low turnout is not a reason to not have directly elected mayors and to not have devolution.
Actually, your example on Australian compulsory voting, I've now been using widely because, as you say, it changes the conversation. I certainly don't think the government would have been as worried about certain U-turns they've made recently had it not been for the fact that the relevant groups could turn out and vote. The problem is, taking this as a whole, you've got this, and then the next stage of this is look at Surrey. So Surrey this week had its first meetings of the voluntary committees that are setting up the new councils. So you've got, they're made up of an equal number, 50-50. 50% of the committee is made up from existing Surrey County councillors. 50% is made up from with a representative from each borough in the new council area. So you're looking at the leaders typically or very senior cabinet member with those boroughs. These committees will be deciding ahead of the elections and the election of the new shadow council. They will be recommending constitutions, schemes of delegation. They will be making interim officer appointments. Now, I know some of this is legal technicalities. You can't have a first meeting without a chief exec, for example, and a monitoring officer. But is this another example of old democracy basically influencing new designs? These are old councillors, some of whom, many of whom, all of whom may not be on the new local authority, setting up the constitution, schemes that they're just baking in all the old bad ways that these councils will run, potentially. There might be good ways as well, but there's no public involvement and it will be handed to the new shadow authority in the examples that we've looked at without challenge. Is that not another example of where democracy is being ignored?
It's really hard though. So I would pose the question to anyone espousing that narrative. What's the alternative? I don't have a good solution here. Local government reorganisation is always a nightmare. So I can't see an optimal route through that. And, we share sort of a support of public participation and public consultation and making sure that people are taken on that journey just by very nature of the job we do. But I do see that it's quite a difficult thing to do in terms of local reorganisation. And I don't really see the alternative. They're going to have to create shadow organisations prior to these organisations being established. And I don't really know a good way to do it other than by leaning on the resources that you've got at pre-existing local authorities. Yes, you're right, that can bake in some of the old bad habits, but I think some of that's likely. I don't think that having lots of unitary authorities across the country is necessarily a smoking gun to get rid of. That's probably the wrong analogy, by the way, but it's not the silver bullet. There we go. That's what I meant. It's not the silver bullet to address some of the cultural some of the cultural issues within local government within the UK. So I would say what I've seen in Surrey and what's emerging across other parts of the country isn't perfect, but I don't really see what the alternative is. But you might have one, Rowan.
I mean, I would argue for a greater public involvement. I would have citizen assemblies, focus groups, that kind of thing. I mean, my concern would be that these new super councils, where you've got fewer elected representatives, pose a trust issue. I get that turnout is often low, but I've always been a proponent of the argument that your local councillor has more influence over your day-to-day life than your local MP in most cases, and people need to be aware of that. But also, the economy's tough at the moment. It's hard for everyone. Everyone's feeling that. And these councils and the devolution that can come with it could really unlock a significant amount of finance and economic regeneration. So for me, you need more people, not fewer, to get this moving. I know in Surrey, speaking with the leader of Surrey County Council, his approach is not town and parish councils, and I agree. They're often, they're a weird tier of local government that you think often unopposed in election and very poorly run. I've got experience of that where I live. For example, his approach is a more technocratic local committee, so a combination of the professional services, so the health boards and representatives from the emergency services, that kind of thing, alongside residents making decisions that are more local to them. Should more power, therefore, be handed down to these committees, say, rather than more centralised? Because we're talking about local government reorganisation, allowing people and their communities to make better decisions, but actually, a lot of decisions will be decided higher up. So let's talk about planning in that context. Should householder applications, for example, be determined by local committees and not by a central, much larger borough?
No, I'd go the opposite. I'd say that householder applications should be determined centrally, and the job. In fact, I'm broadly speaking in favour of taking planning up as high as you can possibly get it, because there is a certain NIMBYism that comes when you push decisions down to the lowest level on planning, I'm afraid to say. So my theory has always been that you do huge amounts of public participation and engagement at the local plan making stage, and you set out a vision, and then basically the individual applications become more of a technocratic issue rather than, is this contravening policy? No, it's not. Okay, it gets approved. Yes, it is. And then there's a planning balance that's applied and potentially goes to committee if needed. But ultimately, that's the only way that you're going to get more of a flow of planning applications through the system, in my view.
I mean, my view would be householder applications don't even need human inputs. I would assess it against AI, speeds it up for the householder. I mean, why should a house extension have to go through that level of scrutiny? Seems bizarre to me. Just final thoughts then. So on public engagement, obviously you specialize in stakeholder engagement, engaging with the public, bringing them alongside. You've had an opportunity to look at how, live and in action, say, Surrey is at the moment. To me, I mean, I'm from Surrey. I went back home recently and spoke with friends and family, and they had no idea that this was happening. And it's just months away from the shadow authority elections. What should they be doing to really get the public on side with this and the message out there? Because no one knows what they're going to be voting for in May.
Well, I think good question. The first thing to say is just be realistic about what your expectation is. Local government reorganisation is important, but it is a niche issue. And trying to take it from niche to mainstream is going to be incredibly difficult.
Well, hold on. That's not what we're aiming for here.
Of course. But and the complexity and the difficulty makes it more interesting for us. So although it does mean that I can't come up with a pithy sort of 2-minute answer for you, but so that's the first thing. I suppose the second thing, and I would have quite liked to have seen some more of this earlier on in the process, but you mentioned things like citizens' assemblies and panels. There's no reason to me why you couldn't have convened citizens' assemblies on, local democracy and on local government reorganisation and involve citizens in that way in the process, and then use that as a way to communicate back to residents, what the outcomes were, and sort of drive some interest into it. So that could be one way of doing it moving forwards. But it's going to be difficult because it is a niche issue. I reckon if you put a poll out now and you ask people what their top 10 issues are or their top 20, I tell you what, if you even said what are your top 50 issues, I imagine local government reorganisation would not feature in that list. So there's no simple solution to it, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, I think you're right. And I think I agree. And I think it's got such an important thing to do. Okay, so quickfire. Andy Burnham going to be Prime Minister before the end of this Parliament? Yes or no?
No.
Angela Rayner makes shock return to the Cabinet?
Yes.
Local government reorganisation actually concludes as planned?
Not as planned, no.
And we'll come back to that. And one final bonus question, 1.5 million homes by the end of this Parliament, yes or no?
No chance.
And on that note, we will say thank you for listening. And we hope you enjoyed this podcast. They will happen every so often when there's something to talk about, such as mayoral elections. In the meantime, we've got loads of information on the website, which has the excellently named localgovernmentreorganisation.co.uk URL. Thank you for joining.
Cheers.